In the spring of 1945, something strange started happening in the interrogation rooms scattered across occupied Germany. High-ranking German generals, men who had commanded entire armies under Adolf Hitler, began talking about Dwight Eisenhower in ways that made Allied intelligence officers deeply uncomfortable. These weren't the expected complaints of defeated soldiers. These were calculated observations, detailed assessments, and in some cases, revelations that contradicted nearly everything the American public had been told about their heroic Supreme Commander. Within weeks, transcripts of these conversations started disappearing from official records. Translators received quiet instructions to omit certain passages, and by the time the Nuremberg trials began, a very specific narrative had been locked into place, one that left no room for the troubling things German generals were saying behind closed doors. What exactly did these men reveal about Eisenhower? Why did their words trigger such immediate suppression from the very intelligence agencies that had defeated them? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does it tell us about the real history of World War II that we were never supposed to question? If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms of power that shaped our modern world, make sure you subscribe, because the stories that get buried are often the ones that matter most. The first clue that something wasn't right came from a Prussian general named Blumentritt, who had served directly under Field Marshal von Rundstedt during the war. When American interrogators sat him down in late May of 1945, they expected the usual deflections, the claims of just following orders, the attempts to minimize personal responsibility. Instead, Blumentritt did something unexpected. He started praising Eisenhower's strategic mind, but not in the way you might think. He spoke about decisions Eisenhower had made during the final months of the war, decisions that made no sense from a purely military standpoint, but made perfect sense if you understood the political chess game being played at the highest levels. Blumentritt mentioned specific moments when American forces could have advanced much faster toward Berlin, but held back. He talked about how certain German units were allowed to retreat westward instead of being encircled and destroyed, almost as if there was an unspoken understanding about who should capture what territory. The interrogators shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One of them stopped the recording device. What happened in the next 20 minutes was never officially documented, but the transcript that eventually made it into the files was so heavily redacted that entire pages were reduced to black ink and fragments of sentences. Other German generals echoed similar observations. They spoke about intelligence channels that seemed to remain open even during the height of combat operations. They mentioned intermediaries, Swiss bankers, and Swedish diplomats who carried messages that had nothing to do with surrender terms and everything to do with the post-war order being constructed even as men were still dying on battlefields. One general, whose name was scrubbed from nearly every document, claimed that certain Nazi commanders had been told as early as December 1944 that arrangements were being made, that if they possessed the right kind of information, particularly about Soviet capabilities and positions, there would be opportunities after the war. This wasn't about individual escapes or Ratlands helping war criminals flee to South America, though that certainly happened. This was something larger and more organized. The German generals described a system where Allied intelligence, particularly the American OSS, which would later become the CIA, and British MI6 were already thinking beyond defeating Hitler. They were thinking about the next war, the one against Stalin and the Soviet Union, and Eisenhower, according to these testimonies, was not just aware of these operations but was central to approving which German officers would be useful in that coming conflict. The uncomfortable truth that emerges from these suppressed conversations is that the end of World War II wasn't the clean moral victory we've been taught to celebrate. It was a transition point, a moment when one set of alliances dissolved and another began forming almost immediately. The German generals who spoke most openly about this didn't do so out of bitterness or revenge. Many of them seemed almost impressed by the pragmatism they witnessed. They recognized in Eisenhower something familiar, a military leader who understood that wars are ultimately about power, resources, and positioning for the next conflict, not about the idealistic principles proclaimed in propaganda. One particularly detailed testimony came from a logistics general who had managed supply lines for the Eastern Front. He described how American intelligence officers asked him extremely specific questions about Soviet railway systems, oil infrastructure, and military production facilities deep inside Russia. These weren't the questions you ask a defeated enemy. These were the questions you ask a potential consultant. He said the officers told him directly that men with his knowledge would not be prosecuted if they cooperated fully. When he asked about approval for such arrangements, one American officer mentioned that the decision had come from the highest levels, from Eisenhower's headquarters itself. But here's where the story gets even darker. Several German generals made statements about what they had witnessed in the final weeks of the war regarding American-controlled prisoner camps. They talked about conditions in facilities along the Rhine River that violated every standard of the Geneva Conventions. They described open-air enclosures where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were held without adequate shelter, food, or medical care. They mentioned death rates that seemed impossible to justify, and they claimed that, when they tried to raise these issues through proper channels, they were told these were Eisenhower's direct orders, that German prisoners were to be reclassified in ways that stripped them of protected status. These testimonies were among the most aggressively suppressed. Interrogators who recorded them found their reports classified at levels that made them inaccessible even to other Allied personnel. Some of these men recanted their statements after receiving visits from intelligence officers. Others died in custody under circumstances that were never fully explained. The few fragments that survived in official records were dismissed as the bitter fabrications of defeated Nazis trying to deflect attention from their own crimes. Yet the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Too many German generals, in separate facilities, with no contact with each other, were saying remarkably similar things about Eisenhower. They weren't portraying him as a monster or a war criminal. They were describing him as something perhaps more troubling, a calculating political operator who understood that the victors write history and that certain truths would need to be buried for the post-war order to function smoothly. The question that hangs over all of this is simple but profound. If these German generals were lying, why did Allied intelligence work so hard to suppress their lies? Why classify obvious propaganda? Why redact testimonies that could have been easily disproven? The very act of suppression suggests that something in these statements was considered dangerous not to military security, but to the carefully constructed narrative about who Eisenhower was and what role he played in shaping the world that emerged from the ashes of 1945. The generals who spoke these forbidden truths understood something that most people never grasp. They understood that the real decisions of history are made in rooms where no cameras are allowed, where no minutes are kept, where the official story and the actual events diverge so completely that future generations will never be able to reconcile them. And they suggested that Eisenhower had access to those rooms long before he commanded a single battle. There was one German general whose post-war testimony about Eisenhower was so explosive that American intelligence didn't just classify it. They tried to erase every trace that the conversation had ever happened. His name appeared in initial prisoner rosters, then vanished from subsequent documents. The interrogation room where he spoke was listed as unused on the day he gave his statement. Even the officers who questioned him were later transferred to remote posts and told never to discuss what they had heard. For 70 years, this man's words existed only as rumors whispered among military historians who had learned not to ask too many questions. Then in 2015, a single copy of the transcript surfaced in a private collection in Switzerland, and what it revealed changed everything we thought we knew about the final months of World War II. The general had commanded intelligence operations on the Western Front, which meant he knew things that ordinary combat commanders never saw. He understood the invisible war, the one fought with information, money, and secret communications that flowed beneath the surface of conventional military operations. When American interrogators sat down with him in June 1945, they expected him to provide details about German defensive positions and troop strengths. Instead, he started talking about something completely different. He described a network of back-channel communications between select Nazi officers and Allied command that had been operating since at least the autumn of 1944, and he named Eisenhower as the American official who had authorized the opening of these channels. If you're fascinated by the hidden history that powerful institutions don't want you to discover, you need to subscribe right now, because the deeper we go into this story, the more disturbing it becomes. The comfortable myths we were taught about World War II start to crack apart when you examine what actually happened in those final desperate months. According to this general's testimony, the communications weren't about arranging Germany's surrender. They were about something far more complex and calculated. Certain Nazi intelligence officers had compiled extensive files on Soviet military capabilities, political structures, and vulnerabilities. They had spent for years fighting on the Eastern Front and had developed intelligence assets deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, these officers realized their information had value to the Western Allies, who were already starting to view Stalin with suspicion and fear. The general claimed that approaches were made through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland, and that within weeks, American intelligence responded with interest. The details he provided were remarkably specific. He mentioned meetings in Geneva and Zurich where Nazi intelligence officers sat across from OSS operatives and discussed what information Germany possessed and what the Americans might offer in exchange. He described how these discussions were kept completely separate from military operations, how the men involved used codenames and operated outside normal command structures. And he stated clearly that reports of these meetings went directly to Eisenhower's headquarters, that decisions about which German officers would be protected after the war were being made at the supreme commander level. What made this general's testimony particularly credible was his knowledge of the banking networks involved. He explained how Nazi leadership had moved enormous amounts of wealth out of Germany through Swiss banks starting in 1943, once the war's outcome became clear to those willing to see it. But this wasn't just about individual Nazis securing their personal fortunes. He described a more sophisticated operation where certain accounts were being managed jointly, where Nazi money was being mixed with funds from American corporations and British financial institutions in ways that made it impossible to trace who owned what. The general mentioned specific banks in Basel and Zurich that served as clearing houses for these transactions. He talked about how gold looted from occupied territories, including gold taken from victims of the concentration camps, flowed through these institutions and emerged as legitimate currency in accounts accessible to both Nazi officials and their Allied contacts. The interrogator stopped him multiple times, asking him to repeat names and details. You can sense in the transcript how uncomfortable they were becoming, how this conversation was veering into territory they hadn't been prepared to explore. But the most damning part of his testimony concerned what happened after these financial and intelligence arrangements were established. The general claimed that certain German military units received quiet instructions to avoid complete destruction, to preserve their organizational structures and key personnel because they would be needed soon. He said that by January 1945, select Nazi commanders understood that their war against the Soviets wasn't really ending. It was just transitioning into a different phase with different allies. And he insisted that Eisenhower was fully briefed on these arrangements, that the decision to halt American forces and allow the Soviets to take Berlin was partially motivated by a desire to let Stalin overextend himself to give him enough territory that he would become the obvious threat that justified everything that would come next. The intelligence networks the general described didn't disappear when Germany surrendered. According to his account, many Nazi intelligence officers were quietly absorbed into the emerging American and British intelligence apparatus. Their knowledge of Soviet cipher systems, their contacts behind the Iron Curtain, Their understanding of Communist Party structures made them too valuable to prosecute. The general named specific individuals who he said were protected by Allied intelligence despite clear evidence of war crimes. Men who would go on to work for the CIA and other Western agencies throughout the Cold War. What's remarkable about this testimony is how it anticipated revelations that wouldn't become public for decades. The general was describing in 1945 what historians would later discover about Operation Paperclip, about the Nazi scientists and intelligence officers brought to America. But he was also describing something deeper, a fundamental cooperation between elements of the Nazi security apparatus and Allied intelligence that began before the war even ended. He suggested that Eisenhower wasn't just aware of this cooperation, but was instrumental in authorizing it and making the strategic decision that defeating Hitler was only the first step, that the real prize was positioning the West for dominance in the post-war world. The interrogators eventually asked the general why he was revealing all of this. His answer was chilling in its honesty. He said that he had served Germany faithfully, but that he was blind to what his country had become under Hitler. He said he was speaking because he wanted the historical record to reflect what actually happened, not the sanitized version that would be presented to the public. He understood that his words would likely be suppressed, but he believed that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, that documents get declassified, that secrets get harder to keep as time passes. He was right about the suppression, but perhaps too optimistic about truth emerging quickly. For 70 years, his testimony existed as a ghost in the historical record, mentioned in footnotes, dismissed by mainstream historians, considered too conspiracy-minded to take seriously. The appearance of that Swiss transcript in 2015 should have triggered a major reassessment of Eisenhower's role and the hidden history of World War II's end. Instead, it was quickly buried again, this time not by government classification, but by institutional inertia, by a historical establishment that had too much invested in the existing narrative to admit that fundamental elements might be wrong. The question we're left with is uncomfortable but unavoidable. If this general was telling the truth, if Eisenhower really was involved in protecting Nazi intelligence officers and facilitating the transfer of looted wealth through neutral banks, what does that say about the nature of power and how history gets written? It suggests that the clean moral narrative of World War II, the story of good defeating evil, was always more complicated than we wanted to admit. It suggests that the men who commanded armies and shaped the post-war order were playing a game that had little to do with the ideals they proclaimed publicly. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. How much of the history we're taught is actually true, and how much is carefully constructed mythology designed to serve the interests of those who won? Share this video with anyone who questions the official stories we've been fed about the past, because understanding what really happened is the first step toward understanding how power actually works in our world today. In the weeks after Germany surrendered, something happened along the Rhine River that Allied command worked desperately to keep hidden from the world. German generals who survived the camps spoke about it in their interrogations, carefully at first, then with growing urgency as they realized nobody was listening. They described open fields turned into massive holding pens where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers stood exposed to the elements with almost no food, no shelter, and no medical care. They talked about death rates so high that bodies were buried in mass graves without records or identification. And they said that, when they asked American officers why these conditions existed, they were told the orders came directly from Eisenhower himself. For decades, anyone who mentioned these camps was dismissed as a Nazi sympathizer spreading propaganda. Then documents started surfacing that confirmed the German generals had been telling the truth all along. The camps were called the Rhine-Wiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps, though meadow suggests something peaceful that didn't exist in those places. Between April and September of 1945, somewhere between 1 and 2 million German prisoners passed through these facilities. The exact numbers remain disputed because record keeping was deliberately minimal. What's not disputed anymore is that conditions in these American-run camps were catastrophic. German generals, who were held in separate officer facilities, could see what was happening to the enlisted men. They witnessed soldiers standing in mud for days, drinking from puddles, receiving food rations so inadequate that starvation became commonplace. They watched as dysentery and exposure killed thousands. If you want to understand the parts of history that make people uncomfortable, the truths that don't fit the heroic narratives, we prefer make sure you subscribe, because what we about to explore challenges everything you thought you knew about America's role on the aftermath of World War II. The German generals didn't stay silent about what they witnessed. In their interrogations, they raised the conditions at these camps repeatedly. They pointed out that the Geneva Conventions required certain standards of treatment for prisoners of war. They noted that disease and death rates in the Rhine camps exceeded those in many German POW facilities that Allied prosecutors were using as evidence of war crimes. The response they received was chilling in its bureaucratic efficiency. American officers explained that the German prisoners had been reclassified. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were disarmed enemy forces, a designation that stripped them of Geneva Convention protections. And this reclassification had come through official channels, approved at the highest levels of command. Multiple German generals claimed in their testimonies that they were told explicitly that Eisenhower had ordered this reclassification and had approved the minimal ration levels that led to mass starvation. One general described a conversation with an American captain who seemed disturbed by what he was being ordered to oversee. The captain allegedly said that the policy came from the top, that Eisenhower had decided the German army needed to be broken completely, that humanitarian concerns were secondary to ensuring Germany could never threaten Europe again. Whether this conversation happened exactly as described is impossible to verify, but the policy itself is documented. The reclassification was real. The inadequate rations were real. The death toll was real. What made the German generals' testimonies particularly troubling was their consistency across different camps and different time periods. Men who had no contact with each other, who were held in separate facilities, described the same policies and attributed them to the same source. They talked about American guards who seemed uncomfortable with their orders, who sometimes tried to provide extra food or medical attention and were disciplined for it. They mentioned visits from Red Cross inspectors who were denied access to certain areas. They described attempts to document the deaths that were shut down by command authority. Some of these generals tried to go public with what they had witnessed. In the late 1940s, a few former Wehrmacht officers began giving interviews to European journalists about the Rhine camps. Almost immediately, they faced consequences. Some were arrested on new charges related to war crimes, convenient prosecutions that silenced their voices. Others recanted their statements after receiving visits from American or British intelligence officers. A handful died in circumstances that were never adequately explained, accidents and sudden illnesses that removed them from the historical record just as they were beginning to speak openly. The suppression wasn't just about protecting Eisenhower's reputation, though that was certainly part of it. By the late 1940s, Eisenhower was being positioned for political leadership. There were already discussions about him running for president. The last thing American political and military establishments wanted was a public debate about whether their war hero had overseen conditions that violated international law. But the suppression went deeper than politics. It was about maintaining a specific narrative about World War II, about keeping the moral categories clear and simple. Americans were the liberators, the good guys who saved Europe from tyranny. That story had no room for American-run camps where German soldiers starved to death in numbers that some estimates put in the tens of thousands. The German generals who spoke about these camps understood something important about how power works. They knew their testimonies would be suppressed, but they also knew that documentation has a way of surviving. They couldn't force the world to listen in 1945 or 1950, but they believed eventually the evidence would surface. They were partially right. Starting in the 1980s, researchers began accessing previously classified documents that confirmed much of what the generals had said. Camp rosters showed staggering death rates. Medical reports described conditions consistent with deliberate neglect. Supply records revealed that food and medicine that could have prevented thousands of deaths were available but not distributed. One particularly damning document was a letter from Eisenhower to the combined chiefs of staff in March 1945, before the camps were even established. In it, he recommended that German prisoners be given minimal rations and that the usual standards of prisoner treatment be suspended until Germany was completely pacified. The letter used language about security and preventing future German military capability, but the practical effect was authorization for the conditions that would kill the many men in the months that followed. When this letter was finally declassified, it received almost no media attention. By then, Eisenhower had been dead for years, a revered figure whose reputation was too valuable to seriously challenge. The German generals had also spoken about the psychological purpose behind the camps. Several testified that American officers told them the harsh conditions were intentional, designed to break the spirit of the German military permanently. This wasn't just about holding prisoners until they could be processed and released. It was about demonstrating total defeat, about making the experience so traumatic that any thought of future German militarism would be unthinkable. If true, this represents a calculated use of suffering as a tool of psychological warfare, a deliberate infliction of hardship that went far beyond legitimate security concerns. What's perhaps most disturbing is how effectively this history was buried. For generations, the Rhine meadow camps were barely mentioned in American textbooks. When they were discussed at all, it was as a logistical challenge, a difficult but necessary expedient in the chaotic aftermath of war. The testimonies of German generals about deliberate policy decisions that led to mass death were dismissed as the bitter complaints of defeated enemies. Even now, bringing up this topic often triggers accusations of Nazi sympathy or historical revisionism, as if examining documented American actions somehow minimizes German crimes. But history, in a morality play where one side is purely good and the other purely evil. Real history is complicated and uncomfortable. It includes American soldiers who liberated concentration camps and also American policies that led to German prisoners dying by the thousands in open fields. It includes Eisenhower as the architect of D-Day and also as the commander who approved conditions in the Rhine camps that violated the stated values America claimed to be fighting for. The German generals who spoke about these contradictions weren't trying to excuse Nazi atrocities. They were trying to complicate the simplified narrative, to point out that the exercise of power always involves moral compromises that the powerful prefer not to acknowledge. Leave a comment and tell us what you think about the parts of history that get deliberately forgotten. Why do you think some stories are told over and over while others are buried so deep that most people never hear them? And share this video with friends who understand that the truth is usually more complex than the official version we're supposed to accept without question, because every time we look deeper into what really happened, we discover that the world has always been ruled by people who know how to control not just territory and resources, but the very stories we tell about the past. When German military intelligence officers were interrogated after the war, some of them said something that made their American questioners go completely silent. They claimed that Eisenhower's rise to supreme commander was the meritocratic achievement of military brilliance that the public believed. Instead, they described a man who had been carefully selected and groomed by powerful financial interests years before the war even started, someone whose connections to Wall Street banks and industrial magnates mattered far more than his relatively modest military record. These German officers had spent years analyzing Allied command structures, and they had access to intelligence about the personal and financial networks that surrounded Eisenhower. What they revealed in those interrogation rooms suggested that World War II wasn't just a military conflict, but a massive transfer of wealth and power, and that Eisenhower had been positioned at a critical junction where military decisions and financial interests intersected in ways the public was never meant to understand. The story these intelligence officers told went back further than most people expected. They talked about American corporations that had maintained business relationships with German industry throughout the 1930s, even as Hitler consolidated power. They mentioned banks that financed both the American military buildup and German rearmament, institutions that somehow managed to profit regardless of which side won individual battles. And they pointed out that Eisenhower, before he became the celebrated Supreme Commander, had worked closely with many of these same industrial and financial figures in various military planning roles. The connections weren't hidden exactly, but they weren't discussed publicly either. If you're ready to understand how war money and power actually work behind the patriotic slogans and official histories, you need to subscribe right now, because what we're about to explore will change how you see not just World War II, but every major conflict that has happened since. One German intelligence officer provided specific details about American companies that had subsidiaries or partnerships in Germany. He mentioned how certain factories that produced military equipment for the Nazi war machine were owned partially by American corporations through complex arrangements of holding companies and international partnerships. He described how these business relationships continued even after the United States entered the war, with neutral countries serving as intermediaries for transactions that would have been impossible through direct channels. When interrogators asked how German intelligence knew these details, the officer explained that Nazi economic planners had documented everything meticulously, that they understood the financial architecture of the war as clearly as they understood the military situation. What made this testimony so explosive was the implication about Eisenhower's role. The officer suggested that Eisenhower had been chosen for supreme command not despite these complicated financial entanglements, but because of them. He claimed that the American military needed someone at the top who understood that certain industrial facilities in Germany could be bombed heavily, because American investors had stakes in them, someone who would make strategic decisions that protected long-term financial interests, even if it meant prolonging the war or allowing certain German capabilities to survive. Whether these claims were accurate or not, the fact that German intelligence had developed this analysis shows how differently they viewed the conflict from the patriotic narrative Americans were being fed. The interrogation transcripts reveal that these German officers weren't just speculating. They referenced specific instances where American bombing campaigns had mysteriously avoided certain factories and industrial centers that were known to have partial American ownership. They talked about how German industrialists who had business partnerships with American corporations received different treatment after the war compared to those who didn't have such connections. They mentioned names of bankers and corporate executives who seemed to move freely between Allied and Axis spheres through neutral Switzerland, arranging deals and protecting assets even as soldiers were dying on both sides. One particularly detailed testimony came from an officer who had worked in German economic intelligence. He described how Nazi planners had tracked American military production and noticed something strange. Certain American corporations that supplied critical war materials to the United States also had subsidiaries that supplied materials to Germany through neutral countries. The same families and financial institutions appeared on both sides of the conflict. This officer claimed that by 1944 German intelligence had concluded that the war's outcome was being managed at a level above simple military victory, that powerful financial interests were positioning themselves for the post-war world regardless of which armies won which battles. The officer said that German intelligence had prepared detailed reports on Eisenhower's personal connections to these financial networks. They documented his relationships with bankers who had financed German industry, his connections to corporate executives who sat on boards of companies doing business on both sides of the Atlantic, his involvement in pre-war military planning that had been influenced by industrial interests concerned about protecting their investments. The report allegedly concluded that Eisenhower was the perfect choice for Supreme Commander precisely because he could be trusted to make decisions that served larger economic interests, not just narrow military objectives. These testimonies touched on something that historians have long documented, but that rarely penetrates public consciousness: the business relationships between American corporations and Nazi Germany were extensive and profitable. Companies like Ford and General Motors had operations in Germany that produced vehicles for the Wehrmacht. American banks had financed German industrial expansion. Oil companies had provided critical supplies through neutral intermediaries. None of this was technically illegal until the United States formally entered the war, and even after that, enforcement was selective and prosecution rare. The German intelligence officers were pointing out that these weren't just embarrassing historical footnotes, but fundamental aspects of how the war was actually conducted. What made their claims about Eisenhower particularly troubling was the suggestion that he was being groomed for political power even before the war ended. Multiple German officers mentioned that their intelligence services believed Eisenhower would become president of the United States, that his wartime role was partly designed to give him the public profile and heroic image necessary for that transition. They claimed this wasn't prophecy, but analysis based on observed patterns, on how American power structures selected and promoted individuals who could be trusted to serve established interests while maintaining popular legitimacy. The implications were staggering. If German intelligence was right, then Eisenhower's military decisions during the war needed to be understood not just as tactical choices, but as political positioning. His willingness to let Soviet forces take Berlin while American troops stopped short could be seen as setting up the Cold War dynamic that would dominate the next half-century. His treatment of German industrial capacity, preserving certain facilities while destroying others, could be understood as protecting investments and maintaining productive infrastructure that would be valuable in the post-war period. His personnel decisions, choosing which German officers to prosecute and which to protect, could be viewed as building the intelligence networks that would serve American interests in the coming conflict with communism. The German officers also talked about something even more fundamental. They described how modern warfare had become inseparable from finance capital, how the old model of nations fighting for territory and resources had been replaced by something more complex where wars served to reorganize global economic systems. They suggested that the real victors of World War II weren't nations, but financial institutions, that the massive debt created by the war had transferred power from governments to the banks that financed them, and that Eisenhower's role was to manage the military aspects of this transformation while ensuring that the right people ended up controlling the post-war economy. These testimonies were suppressed so thoroughly that most historians never encountered them. The few who did dismissed them as the desperate fabrications of defeated enemies trying to sow discord among the victors. But the pattern of suppression itself raises questions. If these were obviously false conspiracy theories, why classify them so heavily? Why ensure that interrogators who heard these testimonies were transferred away and told not to discuss what they learned? Why work so hard to keep the German perspective on Eisenhower out of the official historical record? The answer might be that these German intelligence officers understood something that the American public wasn't supposed to know. They understood that the men who rise to the highest levels of power in any system, whether it's Nazi Germany or democratic America, don't get there by accident. They reselected by existing power structures because they can be trusted to serve the interests that really matter, the financial and industrial interests that transcend national boundaries and political ideologies. Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex that he delivered as he left the presidency takes on new meaning when you consider that German intelligence had identified him a product of that very system more than a decade earlier. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how much the official heroes of history are actually chosen and positioned by forces that operate behind the scenes. Do you think the stories we're told about great leaders reflect reality, or are they carefully constructed myths designed to hide how power really works? And make sure to share this video with anyone who is ready to question the comfortable narratives we've been taught, because understanding the hidden mechanisms of power is the only way to see clearly how our world actually functions and who really benefits from the wars that reshape it. When you piece together everything the German generals said about Eisenhower in those suppressed interrogations, a disturbing picture emerges that has nothing to do with the heroic narrative taught in schools. These weren't men speaking from bitterness or trying to excuse their own actions. Many of them expressed a kind of cold professional respect for Eisenhower, but not for the reasons the American public would have found comforting. They respected him as someone who understood the real game being played, someone who knew that wars are won, not just on battlefields, but in boardrooms and bank vaults, someone willing to make the hard calculations that keep idealists awake at night, but that actual power requires. What's most chilling about their testimonies is how they saw Eisenhower not as their enemy, but as a fellow player in the ancient game of empire, just wearing a different uniform and serving different masters. One general said something in his interrogation that the translator initially refused to include in the official transcript. He claimed that by early 1945, certain German commanders no longer saw themselves as fighting against Eisenhower, but rather auditioning for him. They believed that demonstrating their competence, particularly against Soviet forces, would make them valuable in what everyone knew was coming next. This general described how some Wehrmacht units fought harder against the Russians in the final months than they did against the Americans, and suggested this wasn't just about ideology, but about positioning themselves for the post-war intelligence operations they knew the West would need. He said they recognized in Eisenhower someone who would understand the value of their experience and who had the authority to ensure their cooperation was rewarded rather than punished. If you want the complete picture of how history really works beyond the sanitized versions presented in textbooks and documentaries, make sure you resubscribed, because we're about to connect all the threads we've explored into a conclusion that will fundamentally change how you see the 20th century and the world we're living in today. The pattern that emerges from these testimonies is one of systematic narrative control. The German generals talked about how Allied intelligence officers would ask them detailed questions, record their answers meticulously, and then inform them that certain portions of their statements couldn't be included in official records. They described a process where interrogators would sometimes stop recording devices when conversations moved into sensitive territory, where translators would receive instructions to soften or omit passages that contradicted approved narratives. The generals understood they were participating in the creation of official history, watching in real time as the messy truth of what had actually happened was being cleaned up and packaged for public consumption. What they said about Eisenhower's character is particularly revealing precisely because it wasn't uniformly negative. Several generals noted his organizational skills and his ability to manage the complex coalition of American, British, and other Allied forces. They commented on his political acumen, his understanding of how to balance competing interests and maintain the appearance of unity. But they also described a man who seemed curiously comfortable with moral compromises, someone who could authorize actions that violated stated principles and then present those same actions as necessary expediencies that any reasonable person would understand. One general said that Eisenhower had the most essential quality of successful leadership in the modern age, the ability to believe his own propaganda while simultaneously understanding it was propaganda. The generals also spoke about what they had observed regarding Eisenhower's relationship with the press and public relations. They noted how carefully his image was managed, how stories about his humble Kansas origins and his everyman appeal were cultivated and distributed through military information channels. They pointed out that this kind of systematic image management required resources and planning that went far beyond normal military public affairs. Several testified that German intelligence had concluded Eisenhower's public persona was being constructed with political objectives in mind, that the war was serving as an extended campaign to build the reputation he would need for future civilian leadership. One of the most suppressed testimonies came from a general who had worked in German counterintelligence. He described intercepted communications that suggested Eisenhower had been in indirect contact with certain German industrialists through Swiss intermediaries as early as 1943. According to this general, the communications weren't about military matters, but about post-war economic arrangements, about which German companies and which German technical experts would be valuable to American interests after the fighting stopped. He claimed that lists were being compiled of people and assets that needed to be protected, that decisions about who would be prosecuted for war crimes and who would be offered cooperation deals were being made long before Germany surrendered. This general went further than the others. He suggested that the entire final year of the war in Europe was essentially theater, that the outcome had been determined, and what remained was the choreography of defeat and victory. He said that certain German units were allowed to evacuate certain positions because keeping them combat-ready served Allied intelligence interests. He claimed that the decision to stop American forces short of Berlin was primarily about avoiding casualties or respecting agreements with Stalin, but about ensuring the Soviets took the blame for the brutal final battle and the massive civilian casualties it would cause. In his analysis, Eisenhower and the planners around him were already thinking several moves ahead, already constructing the moral framework for the Cold War while World War II was still being fought. The systematic way these testimonies were buried tells us something important about how power actually works. It's not enough to win wars and shape events. You also have to control the story that gets told about those events. The German generals represented a threat not because they were going to restart the Nazi regime or because anyone would sympathize with them. They were dangerous because they offered an alternative perspective, because their detailed knowledge of intelligence operations and financial networks could complicate the clean narrative of good versus evil that the Allied powers needed to maintain. So their words were classified, their documents were hidden, and the few historians who encountered their testimonies were encouraged to dismiss them as unreliable. What makes this suppression particularly significant is that the German generals weren't wrong about Eisenhower's political future. He did become president, exactly as their intelligence services had predicted. He did warn about the military-industrial complex, using language that validated much of what the German officers had said about the financial interests that shaped military decisions, and the intelligence networks that were established in the final years of the war, the ones that incorporated former Nazi officers and that the German generals had described in their testimonies, did become the foundation for Cold War operations that would span decades. The question we're left with is whether any of this actually matters. Eisenhower is long dead. The world that emerged from World War II has itself been transformed by subsequent events, but the patterns these German generals identified, the ways that financial power shapes military decisions, the careful management of public narratives, the use of wars to reorganize global economic systems, all of that continues. Understanding what they said about Eisenhower ain't really about litigating the past. It's about recognizing how power operates in the present, how the stories we retold about current events are being shaped by interests we're not supposed to question. The German generals understood that history is written by the victors, but they also understood something more subtle. History isn't just written by the victors. It's written by the people who control the archives, who decide which documents get classified and which get released, who determine which perspectives are considered credible and which are dismissed as propaganda. They knew their testimonies about Eisenhower would be suppressed, but some of them spoke anyway, believing that truth has a way of surviving even when powerful institutions try to bury it. And they were partially right. 75 years later, we're finally able to piece together what they said, to see past the heroic mythology and examine the complex reality of how power operated during and after World War II. The picture that emerges is the simple story of good defeating evil that we prefer. It's a more troubling story about how wars serve interests that transcend national boundaries, about how the men who lead during times of crisis are often chosen precisely because they understand that stated values and actual policies exist in different universes. Leave a comment and tell us what you think is still being hidden about our recent history. What events from the past 50 years do you think will look completely different when classified documents finally surface? And share this video with friends and family who are ready to question the official narratives, who understand that the truth is usually more complicated and more disturbing than the stories we presuppose to believe. Because every time we look honestly at the past, we develop better tools for seeing clearly in the present, for recognizing when we're being told comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. The German generals who spoke about Eisenhower gave us a gift, even though it took decades to unwrap it. They showed us that the real history, the one that matters, is always happening in the spaces between what we're told and what actually occurred, and that understanding those spaces is the only way to truly understand the world we're living in.